So we all know that mental health is a global issue. In South Africa, since the beginning of COVID-19, I think we've seen about 30% increase in both depression and anxiety prevalence. But how do people know, that they have depression or anxiety? I mean, I think we know we all are very stressed, but, how else would someone identify potential mental illness?
I don't mind jumping in there, Aimee. And I think just to talk to your point, I think COVID just worsened what was already a worsening situation as far as mental health goes. It can vary very much depending on an individual, and it can manifest or present in different ways. But in essence, anyone that is suffering with a mental health condition, they will see it when it starts to impact on their daily living, on their daily functioning. That could be how they manage at work. It could be how they have relationships with loved ones and friends, children, etc. It could be how they manage their, if I said work, but their daily living, functioning, running a house, being productive, all of those things. And when people start seeing that they're not coping with what they normally would be coping, it's often a sign that they may have a mental health condition. And that often may happen before they get the symptoms that people think of traditionally: sleeping a lot, eating too much or not eating, getting very anxious. I think it's really just, for me, the guide is, if someone is not coping with life like they were before, and there's often a factor or a stimulant while they were, they should consider they have a mental health problem in a simplified way.
And I think just to jump in there, Wayne, I mean, with substances. So if they find themselves drinking more glasses of wine than, they usually would, or if they were a very outgoing person and now activities that they used to enjoy, they don't really enjoy anymore. So like you say, it's those subtleties. It doesn't just, hit you.
It doesn't, and that's actually the problem, is that it's often silent.
Yeah.
And that's often why people do not present, because they don't know they have a mental health problem. And unfortunately, sometimes it leads to the worst consequences. If someone, God forbid, takes their life because they've got a mental health, and then everyone says, "Oh, I never even knew that person was depressed." So it's exactly what you said. It's often a silent ailment.
In my clinical practice, some of the most common symptoms would be lack of sleep, perhaps even feeling anxious, heart palpitations, and obviously back pain, especially between the neck and between the shoulders. Those are some of the early presenting symptoms, and people don't know that they have stress. And then it's up to the clinicians to then dig deeper. Then that's when we realize that there's an underlying mental illness, whether it's depression, it's anxiety, or something else that needs more to be looked into.
Now we know kind of, what the symptoms are, signs and symptoms. Some of them are relational, some of them could even be physical, when talking about pain between the neck and the shoulder blades. But once you've identified that, you may be struggling with your mental health, it can be quite difficult to talk about it and to reach out for help. It's not an easy topic to talk about. You don't know what to say, who to reach out to, what is my support system like. But that is quite a complex thing to navigate. I mean, are there any reasons why, and how can we address some of those complexities?
I think, Aimee, there probably are multiple reasons. And the reality, unfortunately, even in this day and age, whilst mental health and mental health related issues are becoming more accepted by society, we are far from where we want to be. And there's a huge amount still of stigmatization, fear, ostracization. A person who thinks they've got mental health doesn't want to come forward because they might think something wrong with them. How's their family going to accept it? How's their work going to accept it? Is it going to impact on their work? Could they lose their job? So there is a huge amount of stigma, and part of how we would address mental health is getting to break that stigma, break that cycle, actually.
Yeah. And I think, Wayne, to add, when you're speaking about stigma, I mean, culturally, there's even stigmas, between cultures. So it's more seen as you're sad. So if it's an emotion and you're sad, why can't you just snap out of it? Or if it is something that you're struggling with, why can't you pray and, get that kind of support? So I think that from the different cultures and culturally, that also does really play a big role.
I think also importantly, the disparities between male and female gender is really an issue, where the old adage that men don't cry, rambo, mambo, jumbo story really doesn't work. It's something that as men, we need to own up and start talking about mental health issues, because only then that we can get the help that we need. Because in all that we read about in articles and we see in our data, it's more females that are coming out and getting assistance from a mental health point of view, whilst men have a higher incidence of committing suicide because they don't talk about these issues. They just go ahead and commit suicide. And we've seen stories about a man who shoot the wife and the kids and then themselves. But women don't necessarily do that.
To add to that, you've actually raised something important as well, is that link between mental illness or mental health and not taking a care to get support and gender-based violence, which is an issue in our country. I know that's not what we're discussing now, but that whole mental health, especially from a male perspective, is a risk of driving into gender-based violence.
Yeah, there's definitely a link. I mean, even if you just look at the family unit, if you're looking at mental health in a family, and how we manage it within the family and the conversations we have in the family, the more we talk about how we feel, I mean, bringing children into the conversations, we're seeing in our data as well, so many more young people presenting with depressive and anxious symptoms, that, if we can talk about it in the household, you can actually catch it a lot earlier and prevent it from developing into a more serious condition.
And I think we can't ignore the role social media plays. So social media and how, we speak about suicide, we're seeing a whole lot of prominent people committing suicide. And the likes of social media, where people are out there saying, that was the coward way out. So it fuels that stigma of, I don't want to say that I'm suffering because this is what the world view is.
Exactly, it's projecting that.
Yeah.
And I think that talks especially when you spoke earlier about mental health issues in adolescents and young children. And people had this perception, and to some degree still, that children don't get depressed, that adolescents shouldn't have mental health, their life is so easy. And maybe all of us of a different generation way back, you wouldn't have really had seen that. But nowadays, the incidence and the increase in mental health issues in the younger generation is huge. And that societal pressure is so big that, you read stories about 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds committing suicide. And when you go into it, and parents said, well, we just never knew.
Yeah, and the pressure isn't just at school.
No.
You've got it on social media too. It's very difficult to monitor what's going on social media. So it all just just increases the complexity around what adolescents need to deal with these days.
I think generally speaking, there's this generational progression to worsening of mental health, because my parents felt they had it tough and they are more mentally resilient, and they felt weaker. And that's how I feel about the younger generation now, because they have everything, but they experience more of these issues. So I think generationally speaking, the older generation had it tougher. They didn't have TV, they didn't have cars, you know what I mean? They had to go and work the fields and all that. We don't. And our kids are having it much easier, but the mental health issues are even getting worse.
I think it's because that pressure is just so much more intense. We may not perceive it, but you're right, that pressure to do better at school because it's becoming such a competitive market. The pressure to fit in societal norms and all that stuff is just becoming so much more that kids are falling foul of mental health issues, or succumbing to, probably a better word.
And to speak to Aimee saying in terms of how important it is that we speak about this in the home environment, we know that globally, mental health care workers, there's a shortage. It's I think the last stats I read, it was 13 for every 100,000, but in low income countries it's 1.4 for every 100,000. So if it's not, we can't rely only on the fact that, you must see somebody. We need to, in the home and in our relationships, in our friendships, be able to support and understand it.
Absolutely, because you actually raised a very important point there when you talk about we need to address the issue in low-income countries. South Africa is a low-income to middle-income country. And unfortunately, I know I am generalizing now, but the ills that come with that, poverty, lack of access to various things, lack of access to infrastructure, all of that, unfortunately, affects the lower income sector of the population and actually puts them at a higher risk of mental health issues. So we have to talk about it in our demographic, especially as far as the shortage of mental health workers in South Africa.
Yeah, and you're 100% right, Wayne. If we're looking at a syndemic perspective, I mean, we've got the socioeconomic foundation for depression and HIV as a combined comorbidity, considering our context. And so it makes it a lot harder for us to manage mental health, but then it makes it even more important for us to take it into the home, to talk about it amongst friends, amongst loved ones, amongst healthcare workers, because we have professions who are also at higher risk of mental illness. And we've seen it now with COVID-19, how the healthcare workers have suffered working those long hours under such intense pressures. So we need to be aware that this isn't just for one population, but it's everyone. Ages, genders, professions. It's a big issue.
Everyone is vulnerable at the end of the day, everyone.